we're going to create a high dynamic range image using a single RAW file. Open the RAW file and load it in Photoshop's RAW preprocessor interface. Apply some lens correction. Then, maximize the recovery to bring in all the detail out of your highlights. Enhance the clarity, the vibrance, and the saturation to suit your taste. The next step involves establishing a suitable dynamic range for the image. Now to do this, one needs to pay attention to the histogram while playing with the exposure slider. A good dynamic range is where the histogram is evenly distributed across the entire spectrum without any major peaks, troughs, or gaps. In this image, you'll see that a good dynamic range is defined somewhere along the lines of about 0.67 EV to 2 EV. We go ahead and create 3 separate component images equally spaced at 2/3 of an EV. Once done, cancel out of the Adobe RAW preprocessor and launch Photomatix Pro. Now we're going to go ahead and load the 3 created component images into Photomatix Pro. You're going to need to specify their spacing, in this case 2/3 of an EV. Hit OK, and allow Photomatix to go ahead and do its default settings to create an initial HDR image. Photomatix will present an initial HDR image. Here's where one needs to tweak things a little. Noting the histogram, we're looking at getting a nice even distribution. The controls on the left will help us achieve just that. The strength slider controls the dynamic contrast of the image. The saturation controls the richness of the colors. You'll want to balance the two to provide a pleasing effect. The light smoothing controls control how edges are accentuated. I recommend using the Natural Plus or Maximum Light Smoothing setting. I'll occasionally change the black and white point of the image, but usually don't change much else. Once done, hit Process. Photomatix will produce a preliminary HDR image. Save this image as a JPEG and open it in Photoshop. Each image has different areas that need to be treated differently in post-processing. To do this, we're going to take advantage of Photoshop's capability to manage layers. The first order of business is to create our selections. This image has 3 distinct sections: the sky, which is formed predominantly of highlights, the foreground of the exterior, which is mostly midtones, and the frame of the window and the walls, which is a combination of midtones and shadows. To create layers, our first order of business is to create selections for each of these regions. In this image, this can be done using the humble Quick Select tool, and then saving each selection to be recalled when creating the layers. Once the key selections have been saved, it's time to create our layers. The easiest way to do this is by loading the selection onto the background, applying some feathering, about 3 pixels or so, using the Ctrl-Shift F6 combination on a PC, and then copying and pasting the content into another layer. Once all the layers have been created, it's important to stack them in the logical order. It's worthwhile naming them to provide some context further into the workflow. We're now at a point where we're ready to treat each layer with some post-processing. We'll start with the layer for the sky. Selecting the layer to make it active, we're going to use a plugin called Topaz Adjust to provide some structure to the sky. Once done, we're going to use another plugin called Nik Color Efex to add some polarization to the sky and give it some more saturation to the blue hues. When finished, we're going to be left with 2 layers for the sky, which we'll link by selecting them both and right-clicking them in Photoshop and selecting Linked Layers from the menu. Occasionally, dust from the camera sensor or the lens will show up. In this case, we can clone it out using the Clone tool. Similarly, we'll address each layer. When using Nik Color Efex for midtone and shadow-rich regions, I recommend using the Pro Contrast feature in Nik Color Efex. This enhances the dynamic range of the image. Once done, it's finally time to save the image. We're first going to save the image as a Photoshop document or PSD file. This is to retain all the information on the separate layers. We're now into the stage of finishing the image. The first order of business is to flatten the image. We then crop the image to make it aesthetically pleasing. In this particular image, the frame for the window forms an integral part of the image. I've chosen to crop this image symmetrically around the axis centered at the center of the window. I also take note of the dimensions of the image. While not mandatory, I personally resize my images along the golden ratio. That's 1.618. This is to create an illusion of a slightly more aesthetically pleasing image. I also recommend applying a little bit of vignetting, about 10%, to draw the viewer to the center of the image where we want their attention to be focused. I do this using Nik Color Efex. Finally, we flatten the image and save it as a JPEG in full quality. If you take a good look at this image, you'll see a lot of noise present. This is part and parcel of high dynamic range imaging, and is something that can be dealt with using noise reduction software. I personally use a piece of software from Imagenomics called Noiseware, which I highly recommend. Close the image out in Photoshop and open it in Noiseware. Here, one can choose from a series of presets. This particular image has been saturated in its colors. Hence, I've chosen the option to treat it for full noise suppression for stronger color. Noiseware treats the image within a few seconds. One can toggle back and forth between the before and after image by clicking anywhere on the image in the Noiseware interface. Once done, save the image by overwriting the existing file. And you're done! You now have a finished high dynamic range image from a single exposure.